How's it going, everyone? This is Jeremy with Commander Quantified, our very first episode, Quantified Theory of Card Draw. If you like what you see, want to support me on Patreon, I'd really appreciate it. You can also click the like and subscribe buttons, and that'll tell you exactly when I actually put new content out. Should be weekly. And with that, let's get right into it. This episode is unofficially sponsored by the Cheesecake Factory because the only thing better than options is more options. With that, let's get right into it. So this is kind of an experiment, if you will, trying to figure out what exactly card draw is, what does it do, what makes it good. The first question you have to ask yourself is, what is card draw? So to answer that question, we really have to ask an additional question, and that is, when you cast this spell, activate this ability, do whatever this effect is, are you net positive on cards? Do you have access to more play options than when you started? If so, it is card draw. If it's not card draw. Pretty easy, right? So if it is card draw, because that's where we're really going with this, is what type of card draw is it? Because certain card draw functions differently. Our first type of card draw is repeatable card draw, where you net one or more cards each time it occurs. So this can be at the beginning of the upkeep trigger. It can be you tap this permanent. It can be just about anything like that, but it has to do at least one card each time that you actually activate it or cast it or anything like that. Our second type is burst card draw, which nets one or more cards exactly one time. So burst card draw is fast, you get a lot, but it only happens once. A lot of like sorcery spells and instant spells qualify as burst draw. There are some types of impulse draw, which we'll talk about in a second, that I would qualify as burst draw. The next type we're going to talk about is insight draw, which is draw that gives access to cards from the top of your library. So it's kind of like having an additional card in hand as long as it meets certain criteria. And our last is impulse draw, which is going to allow temporary access to one or more cards just for a certain amount of time. So you are kind of temporally limited, but it does give access to additional cards. Next, let's talk about repeatable card draw, which is basically card draw that happens over and over again, right? We talked about this just a little bit a second ago, but what are the questions you have to ask when it's repeatable, right? Example, how many times per turn cycle do you get this effect? So as our first example, we'll take Sylvan Library, which is an enchantment, 1 and a green. At the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life or put that card on top of your library. So it gives you the option to draw up to 3 cards, and it's 1 time per turn cycle. So once on your turn is how often you're going to see that. The next example is Valakut Exploration, an enchantment for 2 and a red with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled. At the beginning of your end step, if there are cards exiled with Valakut Exploration, put them into the owner's graveyard. Then Valakut Exploration deals that much damage to each opponent. So this one, you'll notice, is probably only going to be on your turn unless you're cracking fetches on your opponent's turn or something like that. If you play your even your slow fetches, Evolving Wilds, where a land is going to enter tapped on an opponent's turn, you'll get access to that card. But unless it's an instant or something with flash, you're not going to be able to play it. But most likely, you are going to be able to trigger Valakut Exploration multiple times in a single turn if you are playing it. So multiple times on one turn. The next example of a card is Morbid Opportunist. It is a human rogue creature for 2 and a black. It is a 1/3. Whenever one or more other creatures die, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. So you'll notice that it says once each turn rather than like once on your turn or something like that. So you actually can have it trigger on opponent's turns, and if your deck is built like that, let's say you're playing Aristocrats, you will be able to trigger this pretty much every turn. So it says once each turn, not once just on your turns. And the last example we're going to have is Rustic Study, which is an enchantment for 2 and a blue. This is kind of the big bad of the format. It says whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1. So this particular one, your opponents most likely are going to be multi-spelling, casting 2 or more spells per turn. And this can draw you multiple cards on each turn. So this is the first question we have to ask when we're quantifying repeatable card draws. How many times does it draw us a card per turn cycle? Now there is a second question we have to ask about repeatable card draw, and that's how many cards do you get for each trigger? That is a very important question to ask. It usually is 1, but there are certain effects that will give you multiple. So here's an interesting example. Amareth the Tormented Prophet is 1 and is it 1 blue red legendary creature human wizard. If you would draw a card, exile the top 2 cards of your library instead. You may play those cards this turn. That is a 2/4. So this in particular, each time it triggers, so you would draw a card, now you have access to 2. So that nets you a card each time that you are drawing a card. So that would be 2 cards per trigger. Another example, Guardian Project. It is an enchantment for 3 and a green. Whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it doesn't have the same name as another creature you control or a creature card in your graveyard, draw a card. So in Commander, this just means play a creature, draw a card. Unless you're playing Pack Rats, and this is somehow in the deck. So this triggers 1 time for each cast, right? Or for each enters the battlefield, which can be really good with like flicker or recursion strategies. So that one is 1. The next one we're going to look at is Esper Sentinel. It is a single white mana for a 1/1 artifact creature human soldier. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card. That player, unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. So you will draw a card, singular, each time that this triggers. So it's going to be one of those that on the turn cycle you can draw up to 4 cards, so it scores really well. The last one we're going to look at is Consecrated Sphinx. It is a creature Sphinx 4/6, 4 blue for casting cost. It has flying, and whenever an opponent draws a card, you may draw 2 cards. So that says basically in a turn cycle, you're actually going to end up drawing 6 cards if this survives minimum, because of their draw step, they will draw at least 1 card. This one in particular draws 2 each time that you have it trigger. So that's one of the other things we have to be looking at for repeatable card draw. How many cards do you get per trigger? So let's actually utilize these different questions. We're going to talk about our 4 core measurements and how they stack up when you're looking at repeatable card draw. We're going to use Esper Sentinel as our example. So in the realm of utility, what does this look like? Well, this is card draw, so it scores 1 point, right? Because it's a creature, it will also score some amounts of points just for being a creature and passing the vanilla test, which is the mana cost versus the power and toughness. The efficiency is stellar on this thing. You are only paying 1 mana for card draw, and usually you're going to be drawing at least an Ancestral Recall's worth of cards. That is a reserve list, ridiculous amount of money card, so this is very good. As far as synergy is concerned, it's highly dependent which deck you put this in. It doesn't really need to synergize with anything in particular, but if you want to throw it in an equipment deck, you can increase its power. So then the people will have to pay like 2, 3, 4, whatever the increase is. Or if you want to play like a soldiers build where your lords will give all your soldiers +1/+1, or same thing with humans, that's an option. So synergy would be evaluated based on the rest of the cards in the deck. And then opportunity is how often does this happen in a turn cycle. So that's what we were talking about earlier, and this can happen up to 3 times in a turn cycle. Next, let's move into burst card draw. And yet again, some questions we have to ask before we start quantifying it. And the first question that we're going to have to ask is, if I cast this on turn 6, how many cards does it draw? Well, you're looking at me and probably saying, why the heck would you say exactly turn 6? Well, here's the deal. With most burst card draw, you are not going to benefit from it more after turn 6 because people are usually moving to execute win conditions after that. And before that, most people are looking at developing. So you're doing most of your recurring card draw and stuff like that. Your burst card draw usually comes in later in the game. So turn 6 is a good metric. I actually have kind of divided this out for you here. Turns 1 through 3, most people are developing engines. You're using ramp. You are putting out your recurring card draw. You're saying, okay, well, I'm going to set up my graveyard strategy by self-milling. Any of those things, these are just developing your engines. We're tutoring to our hands. We're doing different stuff like that. Turns 4 to 6, you are actually kind of accumulating your value and waiting to use it until turn 7, where you start executing your win conditions. Usually people will stop you if you get into them as early as turn 7, but most games nowadays end on turn 8, so you do have to kind of keep that in mind. Burst card draw then being evaluated on turn 6 makes a lot of sense. So moving forward, that's how I'm going to evaluate all burst card draw. So just some examples of this. So if we're using it on turn 6, because that's what we've decided is the best way to do it, we're going to start with Commune with Lava, which is one of those that is both impulse and burst draw because it's drawing you a lot of cards all at once. If you cast Commune with Lava on turn 6, it is likely that you have ramped at least 2 times, if not more, with how many mana rocks and ramp spells we run these days, somewhere in the area of 12 in a deck. So this at instant speed is going to exile the top 6 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. So that is going to be up to 6 cards. You can do less, obviously. We are evaluating this at an ideal condition. That's the only way you can really do X spells. If you were thinking maybe, okay, well, I'll hold up a removal spell or something like that, you can take 2 off and we can say that it is 4 cards that it would draw you until that time. Next, we're going to look at Knight's Whisper. It is a sorcery for 1 and a black. You draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. This is pretty cut and dry. No matter where you put this card, it's going to draw you 2 cards. It is technically considered burst draw because you do end up net positive 1 card. It is a one-time effect, so that's what we're going to define it. And then Shamanic Revelation, one of my favorites. 3 green for a sorcery. Draw a card for each creature you control. It also has the ability Ferocious. You gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. The life gain does come in handy. That's kind of a non-essential function. But as far as drawing a card for each creature you control, on turn 6, you're probably going to be drawing somewhere between 6 and 8 cards. Especially if you are in a creature-heavy deck, which is where you would want to run something like Shamanic Revelation. So let's use this opportunity to put our metric into practice. We're going to use the card Keep Watch as an example. It is a 2 and a blue for an instant. Draw a card for each attacking creature. Utility, it is a card draw spell. That is all it does. Efficiency, it is 2 and a blue, so 3. Synergy, usually you're going to be playing a creature-heavy deck. This would go great in like a Kanji Skywarden Flyers deck. I play Tanazir Quandrix, which is an excellent aggressive deck, and you probably are drawing something like 4 cards or so off of it when you cast it on turn 6. Maybe even more than that, actually. You'd probably be closer to 7, so like the 6 to 8 range we were talking about. That's generally where you want to be. And then as far as opportunity, it's at instant speed, so you actually can use this if your opponents are attacking you. So this card is extraordinarily good in the opportunity area, where something like Shamanic Revelation would fall short. So it actually gets a 4 rather than a 1 in the opportunity section. And let's move on to Insight card draw. Insight, here's the question you have to ask. is how many card types does this insight draw access, and what percentage of those cards are there in your deck. So we're going to start off with the card Bolus's Citadel as an example. It is 3 and 3 black, 6 mana total for a legendary artifact. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play the top card of your library. If you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to its converted mana cost rather than pay its mana cost, and you can tap it to sacrifice 10 non-land permanents. Each opponent loses 10 life. So this accesses every single type of card, which was what makes this so great. It also happens to cast the spell at the cost of life, which as long as you're at 1 life, you haven't lost the game. So it will say pretty much everything. One thing to be aware of when you're looking at Insight Draw is if you have already made your land drop for turn, you are not going to be able to make an additional one off of this, even if it says you can play the cards. So be aware of that. Play things like, if you have a bunch of like fetches in your deck, don't go out and buy them. They're expensive. Less expensive now that they just did reprints in Modern Horizons 2. But still, that is a way to kind of shuffle your deck and put something different on top so you can keep going with your Insight Draw. Same thing with something like filtering, your Scroll Racks, your Sensei's Divining Tops, again, very expensive cards. This particular type of card draw is hard to work around and usually pretty expensive to do so with. The next one we're going to look at is Auger of Autumn. It is 1 green for a creature human druid. It is a 2/3. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play lands from the top of your library. And it has the ability Coven. As long as you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, you may cast creature spells from the top of your library. This is very similar to another card, Courser of Crufix, which does the land function of this, but instead when a land enters play under your control, you gain a life. I will happily trade that to be able to cast creatures off the top. This is an excellent card. Do not sleep on it. It can cast 2 different types and is a creature itself, so has other uses and utilities. The next one we're going to look at is Experimental Frenzy. It is an enchantment for 3 and a red. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play the top card of your library, and you can't play cards from your hand. You can also pay 3 and a red to destroy Experimental Frenzy. So this is kind of interesting. Luckily, it does say play, so you can actually play lands from the top of your library. That would be kind of crazy if you couldn't. It's not like you don't draw cards at the same time, but you can't play spells from your hand, so you're legitimately just hoping to storm off from your library and hoping that this works. I would not advise playing this unless you're playing something like Burgi Storm. That is a good archetype for it. Otherwise, it's just too risky not being able to cast cards from your hand. You only have access to 1 card. You lower your hand size to 1 constantly. That's rough. Another card, Verge Rangers, 2 and a white for a creature human scout 3/3 with first strike. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. As long as an opponent controls more lands than you, you may play lands from the top of your library. So this is kind of a catch-up card, which is a lot of what white does. It does not necessarily get ahead, and it only really accesses that exact type. So it would be lands only. I could see playing this in like a lands utility type deck. Something that really utilizes those would be good. But again, it's only at sorcery speed. Yeah, white is usually going to be the weakest of these particular effects. And the last one we're going to look at is Future Sight, which is an enchantment 2 blue, so 5 mana total. You play with the top card of your library revealed, and you may play the top card of your library. That's another thing I forgot to mention about Courser of Crufix, is that it does make you play with the top card of your library revealed, so you are constantly going to be showing your opponents what your next card is. Unless you have some sort of interaction in hand that can kind of hold up removal or counter spells or whatever. But still a very powerful effect, being able to cast any spell or play any card from the top of your library. Really good. So let's move on to quantifying our insight draw with our 4 core measurements. We're going to use the card Vizier of the Menagerie. It is a creature, Naga Cleric, for 3 and a green, and it is a 3/4. It says you may look at the top card of your library at any time, and you may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card. You may spend mana as though or mana of any type to cast creature spells. So this is kind of cool. It does do some mana fixing for you to cast creature spells, and it doesn't say just from the top of your library. So any of the creatures in your hand you can also cast and spend mana as though or mana of any type. So as far as utility is concerned, this is going to be technically card draw. It is technically mana fixing, so that is like a 1.5 pointer right there, plus points for being a creature. As far as efficiency, it is a 4-drop 3/4, so it would probably not end up passing the vanilla test. So it would get a little bit deducted for that. As far as synergy is concerned, you want to be able to consistently cast the creature cards in your deck, and put enough in there that this is worth it. So I would say, like, if you have something that has like a lot of triple pips or something like that, like different colors, the fixing is going to come in a lot of handy. You do want to be at least playing 25 creatures, which is honestly kind of low. I probably wouldn't end up playing this unless I was running closer to like 32. But that's personal opinion. That's up to you how you want to do that. Opportunity, unless you have flash, this is going to be at sorcery speed, so it's only going to score 1 point in that category. Let's move on to a variation of Insight card draw, and it's cheating into play. So the questions you have to ask here are how many card types does it cheat, and what percentage does it cheat in the deck? One of the big bads that one of my buddies Chris plays is Gishath Sun's Avatar 5 and Naya, or red, green, white. It is a legendary creature dinosaur avatar. It is a 7/6 with trample, vigilance, and haste. Whenever Gishath Sun's Avatar deals combat damage to a player, reveal that many cards from the top of your library. Put any number of dinosaur creature cards from among them into the battlefield and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So this is just going to absolutely slam out dinosaurs. I think we figured out that 32 was in fact the right amount for this, because you'll be getting like 1.5 per hit at least. You generally want to be hitting 2 if you can, but there aren't that many dinosaurs out there yet. We're also going to look at Muxus, Goblin Grandier. It is a 4-red legendary creature, Goblin Noble. It is a 4/4. When Muxus Goblin Grandier enters the battlefield, reveal the top 6 cards, of your library. Put all Goblin creature cards with converted mana cost 5 or less from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. It also has whenever Muxus attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each other goblin you control. So same kind of deal. This is just going to be an enters the battlefield effect, so it's only going to happen one time. But you can get a very significant amount of goblins onto the battlefield, and it will just be kind of crazy. The last one we're going to look at is Amareth the Lustrous. It is a legendary creature dragon for 3 in Bant, or green, white, blue. It is a 6/6 with flying. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, look at the top card of your library. If it shares a card type with the permanent, you reveal that card and put it in your hand. So this kind of is Insight Draw in the way that it's only really looking at the top card and putting it into your hand. But definitely if you're running something like artifacts, I think that that's honestly the strongest thing with this is artifacts, is you get an artifact token, look at the top card, it's an artifact, put it in your hand, play the artifact, get the next card. You can just completely refill your hand really quickly. So let's quantify the cheating draw Insight version. So we're going to look at utility, efficiency, synergy, opportunity. Winota, Joiner of Forces, is a legendary creature, human warrior for 2 red-white, and it is a 4/4. Whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a human creature from among them onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until end of turn. Put the rest of the cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. This is a crazy card. Anybody who's played against it knows that. As far as utility is concerned, it's card draw and ramp because it's both drawing you cards and casting them without paying their mana costs, which is pretty crazy. As far as efficiency, it hits right there. It is a 2 red white for a 4/4, so that actually is exactly what we're looking for. Synergy. You want humans that make non-humans, because then the non-human tokens can swing and get new humans from your library. That is kind of the, I don't want to say narrow, but it's a pretty narrow strategy. But it's extraordinarily effective. They're tapped and attacking, indestructible. This does only happen during your attack step, so it only scores 1 point for that. Next, let's talk about Impulse card draw. It is the card draw that's going to let you look at the top of your library and have a certain amount of time to access and play those cards. So the questions we have to ask is, how many turns are the cards accessible for? And are they cast or play? There are certain cards that will say cast, which means you can't get lands off of them. The play ones you can get lands off of, and that's the difference there. And then certain cards are going to say that you can have access to this until the end of your turn or the end of your next turn, which is a very large difference. These particular cards are going to say till the end of your turn. Lelia the Blade Reforged, Valakut Exploration, Dream Pillager, Harnfell the Horn of Bounty, which is the backside of Bergie and Jeska's Will. These are all going to say play, and they're all going to say until end of turn. The interesting thing about these is they usually don't cost you additional options to activate. So you recoup your investment is what I should say. So when you swing with Lelia, you exile the top card, but you didn't actually pay for Lelia on the turn following her, so you can cast that card and you haven't paid additional mana to do it. This other set of cards is going to be something like there's Reckless Impulse, Breya's Apprentice, Prosper Tomebound, Escape to the Wilds, and Showdown of the Scalds. All of these are going to be until the end of your next turn, so you have longer access to them, and usually these are going to say play. There are certain ones that say cast. Alright, so let's quantify some impulse draw using our 4 core measurements. Outpost Siege is going to be our sample card. It is an enchantment for 3 in a red. As Outpost Siege enters the battlefield, choose Cons or Dragons. Cons is at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. And Dragons is whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege deals 1 damage to any target. So as far as utility is concerned, this is card draw, and it does have another non-essential function, which is the Dragons half of it. You will probably be choosing the card draw option most of the time. As far as efficiency, that score is just 4, 3 in a red, so it's 4 mana. Synergy, so you can play this in a Dragons deck, or I have played it in an Aristocrats deck, where when you sacrifice things, deals 1 damage to any target. Other than that, it's not going to have a ton of synergy, but you can definitely get away with some stuff. This only happens, the card draw portion at least, only happens at the beginning of your upkeep, so it only scores a 1 out of 4. So I took a little liberty here and did a card draw recommendation by strategy graph for you. These are the different types we talked about: Repeatable, Burst, Insight, and Impulse. And there are the 3 main archetypes. Aggro and Combo we're going to kind of combine here because they generally want to get the game over with very quickly. So each strategy is going to have something a little bit different going on. For aggro, I would say that the amount of repeatable card draw you want is pretty low. It's going to be 2 or less, because by the time everybody else is done setting up, you want to have killed a player already. Usually in an aggro strategy by turn 4 or 5, the first player needs to be out of the game if you're going to be winning that one. Burst. This is where you should put the bulk of your card draw. Because you want to be able to refill your hand as quickly as possible, put out more creatures, and keep the threats going. So 6 to 8 would be my recommendation on that. If we move on to Insight Draw, I would say 2 or less, maybe one of those creatures that pumps out additional creatures. That would be the most that I'd probably put there. And then Impulse Draw, I would say 4 or less. If it is also Burst, that's fine. But having temporary access to draw isn't always the best. You aren't going to last that many turns anyway, so it's best to get it out of the way, and Impulse Draw definitely does draw additional cards. For mid-range, your repeatable card draw is going to look like 3 to 4 pieces. So basically in the early game, you want to get out maybe one of these. You want to say, okay, so for the rest of the game, I'm going to be able to pace with the control deck, but I'm not going to get outpaced by the aggro deck. And that's going to be you're going to be kind of moderate if you're going to be looking at a mid-range deck. Burst Draw, same thing, 3 to 4. You want to be able to have the answers when you need them. You usually run more board wipes in a mid-range deck, so you're going to be able to take care of the aggro deck, and then you're going to be having small evasive threats to get rid of the control player as well. Insight Draw, I would say 4 or less. You can increase your number a little bit from the aggressive strategies. There aren't a lot of Insight Draw that I would recommend. Most of your draw is going to be Repeatable, Burst, and Impulse. And Impulse is usually out of desperation of being stuck in red and another color that doesn't draw cards as well. And Impulse is going to be 2 or less. You want more permanent access to cards if you're going to be dealing with mid-range. Moving on to Control, the Repeatable card draw, you want 5 or 6 pieces of this because you want to be able to have answers every single turn and continue to draw answers every single turn. Your deck has more answers than questions, I believe is how the command zone phrased it. And they can take some credit for the terminology on these as well, Repeatable, Burst, and Impulse Draw. If you're looking at Control the Burst Draw, you want 4 to 5. You're just going to want more card draw in a control deck than you have in a standard mid-range deck, just in bulk, because again, you want to find those answers. Insight Draw, 4 or less. It comes in more handy when you're playing a high volume of instants to be able to have access to the top card of your deck, because it will just permanently increase your hand size without actually increasing your hand size. Impulse Draw, 2 or less. You don't really need this. You have the other types of draw, and you aren't so dependent on speed that you actually need that much of it. Gonna make one more recommendation on card draw placement, and I'm gonna say that it will also kind of depend on where your ramp sits. So later on the next episode, we're gonna talk about ramp and what that looks like. But for now, I'm just gonna say curve your ramp into your card draw as much as you curve your ramp into your commander. So choose card draw that fits inside of your curve. If you're playing a 1-drop, you want to be able to say, okay, well, here's a 3-drop, because that's how much mana I have available on turn 2 usually. If you are playing a 2-drop, you want to be able to say, okay, well, here's my 4-drop card draw. If I don't want to cast my commander on this turn or something like that. There are certain commanders that you don't want to cast as early as possible. You want to have time to do setup and stuff like that. Brutaclad, Marin, any of those other types of late game kind of win condition commanders. All right, let's move on to some takeaways here. There are 3 that I really want to get through on this one. Card draw is any effect that increases your available play options. Impulse draw is still card draw. It is not as good because you don't have access to it for as long. Insight draw is still card draw. You just kind of have to figure out your balance inside your deck. But card draw is any effect that increases your available play options. Run your card draw according to your strategy. So if you're playing aggro, mid-range, control combo, Utilize that graph. I have done a good amount of research on this. I have built just about everything as far as different archetypes over the last 10 years playing Magic, and I really do think that these are the correct, or at least close to the correct numbers. Hopefully that comes in handy for you. And then last but certainly not least, make sure your card draw lines up with your mana curve. You definitely don't want to be trying to play your Sylvan Library when you have 4 mana on the board and your commander costs 3. That's just going to be really hard for you. Use your mana as effectively as you possibly can. With that, we're going to go ahead and end the episode again. If you like the content, please support me on Patreon, like and subscribe, click the bell icon to get notifications. We're going to end off with favorite flavor texts, and that's going to happen every episode. This one is from the M11 Reverberate. It says, "I'm not indecisive, I just don't like to limit my options." I think that pretty much looks like card draw every way you can possibly have it. Anyway, thanks guys, we'll talk to you soon.